Welcome, everybody. Seconding the words, it's very nice to see people face to face again. Obviously, the times of just wearing an iron shirt and no pants are over in Zoom calls. So I'm very happy to welcome you today here, where we're going to be talking a little bit about key management. Now, I will be covering quite a few pieces here. On the one side, why, of course, your private keys need to be secure, depending on what kind of business you're doing. And very happy in order to have a conversation about this afterwards. Also, very happy to have our head of sales Europe and Marcos, who's basically running Switzerland here as well. There are a couple of points that I'm going to say in terms of like an intro of what we're going to be covering. We're going to be looking into a very, very important topic in and around the institutionalization of the space. For 4 years, we've been sitting on panels and stuff, and we've been talking about institutions coming into the space. Didn't really happen. Now is a different time. It feels different. I'm going to tell you why. On the other side, of course, we're going to be talking about how we are securing keys, the other solutions that are out there, and why MPC is a good choice from a security perspective, first and foremost, as well as going into the little bit more in-depth use cases of how you can make them applicable from a custodial level if you interact on the trading side. If you are a corporate treasurer, if you are a payment processor, if you are a neobank, there are all sorts of different ways that you can basically interact with the space, as you all know. But of course, the underpinning custody layer is absolutely crucial there. To kind of give you a little bit of an overview of Copper, so you know who I am. So I'm one of the founding partners and the Chief Revenue Officer. We're doing this now, so we started this whole circus about 4 years ago. We come from the traditional finance background ourselves, mainly asset management and investment banking. But then, of course, the other side of the whole spectrum is, please come in, is the technology piece. And when it comes to the technology piece, of course, we basically had to find a way of bridging the gaps between technology and finance. And that's always a very, very hard job to do, especially if you talk about digital assets. It's scaring a lot of people, at least it did 4 years ago, somewhat does now. We now are, this is a little bit out of date, it's about 450 clients. We only cover institutional clients. I'm going to give you a little bit of a breakdown of who they are. We've got above 20 billion of assets under custody. It's actually going towards about 40 by the end of the year, given the current pipeline. The business has grown as well while we were just four sitting in a cool flattened shortage, trying to figure out of how we can revolutionize finance. We're now about 220 people globally. We're headquartered in London. We've got an office in New York and also one in Singapore. And last but not least, the exchanges bit is very, very important due to the client type that we're servicing. Client types, just to give you the breakdown, about 60% of our clients are crypto funds. Another 20%, which are market makers, HFTs, and prop shops. And the last bucket are in terms of like setup and use cases of the infrastructure when it comes to the custody bit, payment processes, neobanks, coin foundations, this type. So very much custody focused when it comes to securing their assets, which of course in many cases are in the billions. Now, in order to kind of kick this off, and I think it's a very, very important one, the retail angle, I think we've got very well covered, but people are interested in order to understand of how we're going to grow this space. And when it comes to the growth of the space, the institutions are, of course, driving that. Over the course of the last 3 years, you've seen quite a lot of news. If you look at the names that you see, I just basically put a couple out there. We all know Tesla and our good friend Elon, which done very good things for Bitcoin and unfortunately also for Doge. And on the other side, of course, also relatively bad things with the steeper tweets. But what you have is, PayPal having bought up Curve, which was another MPC custody solution. You've got, of course, the Grayscales. You've got BNY Mellon that is going to start offering custody. I'm going to be talking about our enterprise piece a little bit later, especially in and around the custody and key management, as well as in and around Rafa. All those names, and you've seen them over and over. And of course, those guys are mainly long only holders, mainly in and around Bitcoin. We we can go into some depth in and around the fact of like how different chains are interacting or are more complex when it comes to securing them, like Airweave and others. But it kind of tells you very, very clear driver of what is actually happening in that space, even though very early on. Now, custody, of course, becomes the driving force then. Anything that you do on that front is basically underpinned of how you secure the assets and how you can interact with them. When you just look at the base layer of custody of withdrawals, there is that's a whole topic in itself. We have taken an approach of optical air gapping, but I'm going to go into the different types of temperatures and how you basically interact with the assets, deposit and withdrawal in a second when we talk about MPC in further depth. But what this here is showing mainly is, I mean, the curve is pretty clear, and some of you that have been in crypto early on, I'm sure everybody is very happy right now. But it comes down to the fact of how this is going to evolve going forward. Now, it's not the first time that we've seen a asset class, and I think we can all agree by now that this is an asset class in its own right, kind of grow all the time. Equities is a very, very good example here. And as you can see, over the last like 70 years, 80 years, the split was very, very different between the institutional part and on the other side, of course, the retail piece. The space that we're in is moving at an insane speed, and anybody who is working in the space here, which I'm sure the vast majority is, you will see that, of course, the way that this is adopting is happening very, very quickly. For example, DeFi is a very, very good example. It's like we didn't even figure out the centralized finance yet, and we're already talking decentralized. So there is an insane amount of speed and solutions and innovations that is going to happen over the course of the next 3 to 5 years, which is going to mean that we are seeing quite a dramatic shift between the institutional players on the market, and you see news coming out every day, and on the other side, the retail piece, which is the good side about this industry, because as you know, everybody could theoretically be a maker, everybody could be a taker. So on that front, there is a lot that we will see in terms of the adoption rate. On average, if you look at the last 10 years of data that we have, especially the last 4 years, you can kind of look at a factor of about 15 in terms of the adoption rate in order to catch up with something along the lines of 75% being an institutional, being an institutional driver. And that comes with a lot of questions. I'm spending a lot of time, the whole team globally is spending a lot of time speaking to those traditional guys, the BlackRocks, the Millenniums, the Citadels, the Mans of this world. And they all have the same question. Number one, on the one side, how can we reduce risk in any shape or form? That's operational risk, that's counterparty risk. And on the other side, of course, how we can participate, meaning access. So how am I able to interact with exchanges? How am I able to interact with market makers directly, OTC desks? How am I able to interact with peers? How am I settling? So all those points are absolutely crucial when it comes to understanding of why we do what we're doing. Now, I kind of mentioned a couple of those points already, but when it comes to the digital asset space, you have those three main buckets. I kind of mentioned them already. The operational risk is extremely, extremely important, and you need to have solutions in order to access that space efficiently. Operationally, we have unfortunately seen over the last years fraud case happening left, right, and center. I think the latest one, which you may remember, is anything around Virgil. Virgil was a very good case. Assets weren't secured within a enclosed ecosystem. We have a product for this that we released about 3 years ago, which is called the Walled Garden, which basically makes sure that assets can travel within that ecosystem but cannot leave. Others by now have copied that. Actually, some of them actually called it the same thing, which is, they could have done a little bit better on that front. On the other side, of course, counterparty risk. That is a big, big topic, simply from a custodial perspective. Because what you're faced with is that exchanges are also acting as custodians. Now, our view is that this is a really, 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 really stupid idea. Most of them, of course, have no real concept of segregation of duties. The regulatory part is going to play a massive role there. But if you're in charge of matching and execution, you shouldn't be doing custody. That's as simple as. And for that, we basically released a product called ClearLoop, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit towards the end. The fragmented and evolving landscape, This is also kind of gives you a little bit of an insight with regards to DeFi, the optionality that this asset class basically allows you to do. And I mean optionality in terms of liquidity and in terms of access. You have the ability to, theoretically, let's spin this forward, right? You sit on the airport and you've got an insurance contract on the delay on your plane. And while you're sitting there, you could basically theoretically trade that in a smart contract against BTC or wrap BTC. So what you now suddenly have is the ability to inject liquidity and have liquidity pools where you would have never been able to do this beforehand. Never mind cross-chain and all the good stuff that you're hearing left, right, and center in terms of innovation that is happening and drives the space forward. For this, of course, you need a certain set of infrastructure in order to do this. Now, the way that we have done this, and I'm going to go now into how we're securing keys and why we chose MPC mainly. And actually what we've done day one, because we didn't use MPC all the way through. You need to have proper safeguarding capabilities. And you will hear a lot of people say, because there is key management on an MPC basis, we're going to talk about this, that you are a custodian. That is not true. Custody is being done in a very, very specific way. And if you want to use MPC, you need to use it in its true format, which means that you need to stay in segregated instances. We're going to go into this. The trade infrastructure I'm going to talk about lightly, but this is not necessarily the case here. What we want to discuss in this masterclass. So, why MPC? Actually, go straight to the next slide. There are different types of how you can provide a custodial setup and how you are securing your keys. What I mean there is, most of them you are aware of. Hot wallets is one thing, from an institutional perspective, that you mainly are going to shy away from. It is not necessarily based around the fact of key material itself, like in terms of its true form. It's more about the fact of like, do I have a centralized risk point? Meaning, is there a private key in its entirety sitting somewhere? Which is the key part here. Now, hot wallets, you all know how this works. You put the key online. There are different ways. It's your Docker containers, whatever it is, and you basically just push a button. There might be a governance level that sits on top of it in order to approve a transaction, and ultimately the transaction is being broadcast. Software wallets is pretty straightforward as well, but again, in this case here specifically, you're dealing with a private key in its entirety, and there are quite a few of those solutions out there. Again, you've got a centralized risk point. Hacking, I cannot tell you. I mean, our business, we are in the business actually of security more than anything. We've got about 30 people sitting there simply on the security side. If you would go down the rabbit hole of like what people nowadays are capable of, you would potentially never touch this asset class because you're scared you get shit this. Sorry for my English. And when it comes to this, of course, we wanted to take the approach in order to kind of distribute this by default. HSMs, a solid solution, don't get me wrong, but also here there are various ways of how you can do this, just as an overarching approach when it comes to securing your keys. Hardware security modules is a way to do it. There are several providers, the old ones, for example, that have been like actually using a Swiss mountain and dogs and guns and guards, but there's a cable sticking out somewhere, which means that you have a centralized risk point after all. Key sharding, this is what we opted for when we actually released Custody for the first time. That was mid-18, March, April 18. What we were using at that time was Chamis secret sharing, which basically means that you are creating a private key, you split it up into parts, and then encrypt the parts. AES-256, PDFP2. But the part here is the important piece of like why we ultimately opted into secure MPC. And there are several points here. On the one side, MPC was around for a little while, and I'm going to show you why. But the question was, how are we able to eradicate single and central points of failure, whereas being able to allow clients to be effective and efficient when it comes to their operational business on a day-to-day basis, which is a very, very thin line. And the way that we basically implemented this, apart from the withdrawal process when it comes to the optical air gapping piece, which I'm going to talk about, is the fact of like making sure that there is no ability in terms of segregated instances to either recreate or ultimately fetch the key material. even split, even you say you use MPC, but it cannot come back to a central point. Now, this is the difference between true MPC and MPC solutions, which is the way that basically we set it up, and I'm going to show you which way that's done. Who started this? MPC originally comes from good old Professor Andrew Yao. He has been working on this for a long time until it basically was released. MPC in its nutshell was actually used for a completely different purpose, which is in combination with ZKPs, which are zero knowledge proof protocols, very, very useful. In a nutshell, for people that maybe are hearing this for the first time, zero knowledge proof is in a nutshell sharing information with each other without ever revealing the information itself. So you're able to theoretically imagine you walk into an American bar and you look, young, and you say, I want to order a beer, and all you need, I want to see ID. You don't have to ID. I know you are. So in its very simplest format. But we're going to talk about how it can be used. In this case, in 2008, it was used for a Danish sugar beet auction. You see in which way it was basically done. But bids were basically matched with sellers, and ultimately without ever disclosing actually all the details and identities of the bidders. The spin of actually making this available for cryptographic assets was a little bit more complex, and it took a little while. I think MPC really properly got onto the stage globally in 2019, 2020, in and around then, and it was a very it was an early stage technology, to be quite frank. But in this case, now, if you want to secure your assets properly, I think there is no way around in order to use MPC technology to do so. Now, kind of coming into the point of how you do the key management itself. Now, the way that we do it, maybe give a little bit of an insight there. The way that we do it is that you have an application for Copper Unlimited. And that application lives in segregated instances, i.e., on Copper side, somebody sits in London or New York. On the client side, somebody sits in Zurich. And a trusted third party, which is the third part of the puzzle, is sitting in Paris. Now, those three instances always stay segregated, whereas you need 2 out of 3 in order to sign a transaction. Whereas the trusted third party doesn't play an operational role at all. They're just there as a failsafe. Never mind that you have basically encrypted backups as well, but that's just there in order to for an added peace of mind. But the important part is that during the creation of the wallet and ultimately the public address and your master private key, that first and foremost, the private key never exists in its entirety ever. You only have distributed key material that basically sits in those segregated instances. And we as the custodian never pull this back, which is one of the main differences, but I'm going to come to that. In a nutshell, what that means is that you have that you need to derive your addresses from the elliptical curve equations, which is basically underpinning various blockchains. Now, depending on what approach you take, that elliptical curve equation is basically linear. It looks like this. And you basically take 3 R points. And from that point, you basically then derive your key material ultimately. Now, on the MPC side, those elliptical curve equations look completely different. They look like this. You have to imagine it kind of 3D as well. And those R points are being chosen randomly, which means that if you actually, for example, in Shamir's secret, like key sharding, you pick one and you actually are able to depict this, it is quite easy in order to go along the curve and figure out the other parts. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So the way that we do it is, like I said, basically moved across 3 instances in segregated machines and ultimately segregated instances, but I said this before. And you need 2 out of 3 in order to sign the transaction. The process takes 20 seconds. And what you are left with is basically a key shard that is subject only to your instance and subsequently is interactable with whatever you have sitting in custody. Now, during that process, we are never pulling back the shards that are created in those segregated instances, which is very, very important because, as I mentioned before, centralized risk is a massive topic. So what you don't want is having those shards sitting somewhere centrally accessible to the custodian, which is, in our case, the way of why we're doing true MPC in this instance. Now, we basically covered a lot of this already. But the more important part is of how you are how you are drawing attention to when you are choosing your custody provider. And there are certain questions that you need to ask. When it comes to the other approaches, HSMs, key sharding, software wallets, whatever it is, those questions have basically been answered quite simply. But when it comes to custodians on the MPC side, there are certain questions you need to ask. And those questions are mainly in and around where does my key material ultimately sit? You will potentially hear answers in terms of different instances, different servers, but a server is always a risk point because it's just somebody else's computer. So in this case, it is very important to understand of what the key differences are. And in terms of this, of all the different approaches that we've seen in this industry, in terms of securing assets and securing the keys thereof, this is just a very, very small representation of what the risk levels actually are. The good thing is that from 2017, you see that the number has, in terms of theft, has decreased, which means that you also get a more fragmented way of securing assets. The number has gone up of hacking cases, but ultimately the amount of money that was stolen is relatively on the low end. It's kind of dipping off, if that makes sense. Which is the only reason why is because you have more sophisticated custodial solutions that are out there kind of targeting and trying to figure out of how to disable those centralized risk points that are vulnerable to hacking or whatever else it is, even internal fraud, which is the important part. If you are a custodian and you have, for example, clients' key material, you should not be in the position that if somebody goes in there from your operational team because he lost his mind and deletes all the material that is available from the client, your assets cannot be lost. That's the important piece. So the way that we did it, that's basically solving that problem. So apart from others, and I mean, you potentially heard of a couple of those. I hope nobody was affected by them. No. But you basically see a couple of those. A lot of those, as you see now, are like going more into the DeFi space. And this is why why Copper is a little bit more cautious when it comes to DeFi. We do have a DeFi extension that allows you to interact with your MPC wallets and smart contracts. Currently, Ethereum, we are in, I think, 2 weeks' time, we're going to release Solana and Polygon as well, Matic. But we are very, very selective of the smart contracts that you're actually allowed to interact with, because there are some out there, for example, that you pre-sign transactions and at a later point that come and wipe your wallet. And only a certain portion of the assets is actually leaving your custodial wallet to begin with. So those are all things that you need to kind of, which people normally are not aware of. From a cryptographic and from a pure DeFi space, there is a lot of stuff that I still need to learn. If you're interested on the MPC side, I highly recommend that you read Professor Lindell's paper. He's kind of been spearheading this, especially when it comes to digital assets. And there is a handful of people that understand the cryptography, to be brutally honest. Thank God we've got a couple sitting with us. But what it is, ultimately, it comes down to the fact of not having any representation of this here going forward. Because both numbers here should be bloody zero. And definitely not in the millions or in the billions. Now, coming back to the point of like the pure custodial side, like I said, it is very much driven by having that base layer, that base security layer available, which people would go like down the road of saying, okay, custody is a commercialized topic. In many ways, I'm disputing that, but it comes to the fact of how you're able to interact with your custody with whatever it is. Exchanges, like I said earlier, direct counterparties, DeFi. And those points need to be addressed. And what we've basically done at Copper is we tried to figure out over the last 4 years of how we can do that. And we derived that basically solving one problem after another. But the key problem, talking about custody, I kind of mentioned this earlier, is based in and around exchanges. And exchange custody is a scary one in many ways. For retail exchanges are going to be doing fine. What most people don't understand is that exchanges are sitting there basically rehypothecating the assets that are basically deposited, in some cases, some not, and ultimately making a truckload of money, which you don't see a penny cent of. But it's very hard for them to give that revenue line up, right? Now, from an institutional perspective, trying to go in, if you just imagine you're BlackRock and you try to go in, and I'm sure some of you work in traditional finance, to go in and explain to your compliance department why it is okay to pre-fund an exchange that is situated and or regulated on the island of Barbuda, and you're supposed to pre-fund your initial marginal capital there, is going to be a pretty short conversation, which means that in this case you need to find a solution for that problem. And the way that we've done this is by utilizing our custodial. I should have looked at the next slide here. I kind of jumped ahead a little bit. Sorry. Hold that thought. I'm going to come back to that. Our custodial infrastructure and what we are offering on that front. We're talking about the key material and how you can utilize it. Of course, in the first instance, you would automatically think of cold, right? But of course, there are different types of temperatures depending on how operationally you want to be involved and how operational you want to be in terms of efficiency. What we are offering is basically 3 temperatures. You have the cold solution, where the client shard as well as copper shard is offline. You've got the warm solution, whereas the client shard is offline, but they request that copper shard is online, so they don't need to wait on us signing anything. And hot stands for itself. There is a secure Docker container. You put that MPC key material on that server, and ultimately you just have the governance layer on the platform that basically says, okay, which can go very, very granular. You can go like anything up to 2 BTC, nobody needs to approve. And from 2 BTC to 100 BTC, somebody needs to call out the chief information officer or the chief investment officer. From 500 BTC to 1,000, somebody please call President Biden, and he needs to approve this personally. So you can go extremely granular depending on what whitelisting and all this kind of stuff comes by default. But those are just layers of security that need to ask the questions for when interacting with a custodian. Which basically comes to use cases. So some of the client base that we have, coin foundations, I mean, some of them are in public knowledge. For example, Algorand, they've got significant amounts of money with us. Is basically how you can arrange that now and auto-calibrate, for example, how you can manage your treasury effectively. And normally it is an array of different types of temperatures and different wallets, which you can auto-calibrate in between. We've got quite a few exchanges coming to us as well right now, because BitGo seem to have halted any sort of innovation for quite a while, unfortunately. And what it basically comes down to is the fact that you have the ability, not only from a treasury perspective, in terms of, so every single of those boxes here is basically a vault. And those boxes ultimately can interact with a proxy layer that sits in front of it, which is very important for user deposits and ultimately in order to manage withdrawals as well. The beauty about proxies is if you the way that you can set it up, every single proxy, if you want to reuse it, fine. If you want to burn it, fine. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that every single of those proxies, you've got a wallet address, which is like a unique reference code. So even if it ends up in a treasury, in an omnibus treasury, you can always theoretically pick out exactly the BTC that you put in, because you've got the reference of the proxy wallet that sits in front of it. And yeah, in terms of calibration, you can have the biggest amount normally sits in cold storage. Then, of course, you've got the warm functionalities. That's more like in terms of interacting with the hot wallets. And should you want to do bulk withdrawals or whatever it is, you basically have a certain portion sitting in hot. But from a risk management standpoint, that normally is a very, very small amount. But this is how you can basically, on the back end, in terms of the technology stack, when it comes to the MPC side, you can interact and basically create your treasury management accordingly. Which is not only used, by the way, by foundations or alike. It's also used by funds. We have a couple of funds that actually use that approach as well. Now, I kind of mentioned this before in terms of asset support. That's a big one. The interesting part is, like a year ago, everybody was just talking, when you talk about the institutional side and the adoption, everybody was just talking about Bitcoin. Bitcoin and Ethereum, maybe. Now, since, especially on the alts, liquidity has increased quite dramatically. People are quite interested in order to go into that space as well. Now, your support layer of assets that you should, unfortunately, in this case, this is actually wrong. This is the wrong number. We're now, I think it's 43, guys. Yeah, it's 43. Yeah. So layer ones that we support, and subsequently, of course, the layer twos. Last week alone, I think we added 63 new layer twos. I think it was Algo and ERC tokens and SQL. So we're extremely fast of adding new ones, which is, of course, all underpinned with the back-end security procedures, the Q&A stuff. I mean, this is ultimately then what you pay money for. That's why I'm standing against the fact of custody being a commoditized topic in any shape or form, at least not yet. Interoperability, and this is what I said, like, please hold that thought. Now, when you have custody, you want to utilize the asset somehow. And in the early days, we had to find a solution for mainly the funds in and around the fact of like, okay, I can show that I have a custodian, but my clients, my LPs, my investors are asking me the question, okay, if I give you my money, is there any chance that you can misappropriate it? Now, given the fact that exchange is acting as custodians, you can try to wiggle yourself out of this question, but ultimately you have to agree to it, which is a big, big problem. Now, in this case, the way that we've done it, and walled garden, as much as I love this product because it absolutely put us on the map, it is a dying creature. Because in this instance, what you have is assets sitting on the exchange. And to the points that I mentioned earlier, if you are a traditional financial institution, never mind the problems in and around capital efficiency and counterparty risk, which I'm going to touch on in a second, you have relatively, well, there is only so much risk due diligence that you can do on those exchanges in Barbuda, like I said. Now, where ultimately it comes into the point now of what ClearLoop does. And you actually have heard about ClearLoop a little bit in the news, and maybe some of your peers. We've got quite a few clients in Switzerland as well. And ClearLoop is designed in order to do two things, whereas interacting, the base layer is the custody layer. In this case, third-party custody for exchanges. On the one side, to increase capital efficiency, which is a massive one, and I'm going to explain why, and minimize the counterparty risk, which we have kind of covered now already in terms of like, operational risk due diligence that you need to do on exchanges that are common as well. And having assets and basically holding keys to the assets that you pre-fund there by someone. That part here, of course, is extremely important, especially for traditional guys getting into the space. We're talking about, in many cases, nanoseconds in terms of how we transact, trade in the traditional world. 14 minutes, 15 minutes, or half an hour. I mean, if you move Ethereum, sometimes you can pay $1,000 and it's still not there at the end of the day. You have inherent problems when it comes to utilizing your capital efficiently. And what ClearLoop basically does is very simply interacting with exchanges on the basis of your assets sitting in secure MPC custody. So it's your segregated account where assets are sitting put, and all you do is ping tradable balances to the venue, which are becoming available instantaneously. Instantaneously, not true. We're talking about 70 to 80 milliseconds, which is vastly better than a second, which is definitely better than 5 minutes, and definitely better than an hour. So what that basically means now is that you have the ability to loop assets from one venue to the other. In this case, currently it is 7 with Deribit, Bitfinex, Coinflex, and so on. But you potentially have seen the news on Bloomberg, etc. FTX is currently integrating. OKEx is coming. KuCoin, Bybit, and OKCoin as well. And what basically is happening is that you have the ability now to just simply unlock balances, but the assets are stationary; they never move. Which is the beauty. They stay in your secure MPC secure wallet, and you settle post-trade. So that means you execute on the venue like you've done before. You still have the relationship with the venue directly. Like, for example, Christoph is going to negotiate with you the fees, for example, for Binance. And what is happening afterwards is that you then just say, okay, I'm going to settle external from that. So in third-party custody, the way that it should be. If you want to compare it to what we currently are doing, or mostly with most of the exchanges, is that you would have to open an account on the New York Stock Exchange, send some money there in order to buy Apple shares. That's just simply not how it works. So in this case, you are solving a load of different problems. On the one side, of course, external actors, which you don't have any control of, misappropriation. The venue that basically holds your assets has control of that. And of course, interference when it comes to asset seizures. We've seen this in some cases that the DOJ, for example, walked in OPEX's case, and said, well, you guys have done something wrong on the compliance side or whatever it is, and basically withdrawals are ceased. Now your assets are sitting there for the next 3 to 4 months and you don't know when you get them back. You don't want to have that problem. And basically Copper solves this with ClearLoop. Generally, I think I'm pretty good in time. I'm very happy to take a couple of questions. It would be great to kind of chat with everybody afterwards. Like I said, Mike, who's our head of sales Europe, and Marcus is sitting on the far back for some reason. And please find us if you have any questions, and very much looking forward to chatting later. Thank you very much. Questions? What the regulators think about all of this?
Well, do they think anything, and do they understand?
Most
of the regulators I know go, crypto, that's digital, right?
Well, I mean, regulators are actually, they have a very, very hard task ahead of them, because they do realize that there is a saying in English, like trying to squeeze a square peg through a round hole is not going to work here. So what they have to do is completely rethink of how this industry is going to be evolving here. And I'm not talking about, by the way, I'm not talking about Bitcoin and Ethereum here at all. If you ask me personally, I couldn't care less.
It's the basics, because you actually have to define that this stuff is treated as security, currency,
That's what I'm coming to.
Choices.
That's exactly what I'm coming to. So when we talk about the tokenization, that is the interesting part. Like I said, for the time being, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Cardano, Algorand, Solana, they're all the same for me, and they're not going to be, all of them that you currently see on CoinMarketCap are not going to be here in about 3-4 years' time. What it comes down to is what you ultimately classify a certain trading instrument or a certain asset as. And the securities bit is pretty clear. So when it comes to interacting with securities, you have a pretty stringent and very, very straightforward regulatory layer. Now, we're not there yet. For us, I mean, you potentially have seen the news. Philip Hammond has joined us at Copper, who's the ex-finance minister of England. And Philip is extremely involved in mainly on the educational side, which is the big part that all of the actors that are currently in the space from an infrastructure layer have to play. But right now, I think the furthest ahead are the Americans to a certain extent. Even though the SEC said there are securities and there are not securities, and then you ask which ones are the securities, can't tell you that.
No, they released the risk.
Yeah. But when it comes to the infrastructure layer and how you interact, those rules will be very, very clear. But it depends on how you ultimately treat the basic underlying, and that is still relatively open. Time frame. On the regulatory side, I think you will see a couple of regulators. Switzerland is quite good, actually. But you are looking in terms of, like, I need to ask the question back. What, with regards to what? Custody, with regards to trading, with regards to derivatives, with regards to, like, what? Because there are different layers to this. I think on the base layer, you will have some good regulation coming out, some proper regulation in terms of Europe. I can't pick which one yet in the course of the next 1 to 2 years. But it will be very, very specific in terms of, are we talking derivatives? Are we talking custody? Are we talking any sort of trade? Are we talking DeFi? That definitely won't happen. But you know what I mean. So it's a very hard question, and I wish I would have the answer, but I don't have it. I think so, yeah. Because what you're now fronted with is, if Boris Bilowitzki from Copper calls up and says, like, we want regulation, which we've done now for the last 4 years, nobody's gonna do anything. If Steve Schwartzman, Larry Fink, Jamie Dimon, or Brian Moynihan call up and say, we are going to do this now, so you have to give us a framework in which we can operate in, that's a different ballgame, right? So, and this is happening right now.
Yeah, well, the congressional hearings that took place a few weeks ago when Gainesville was inaugurated, half the news was all about investor protection, but half the discussion was on crypto. Yeah, but
you basically just answered the question yourself. It's investor protection. The only reason why the regulator exists is in order to make sure that retail is not getting screwed over. So Gensler's message, if you read I'm sure you've seen it, is a complete 180 to what we've heard before from the SEC, which is a very good sign. But those guys are always behind. Regulators are always behind. And they have to play catch up in this case as well, even more so than they've done in the traditional world.
Hi, Boris.
Hi.
My name is Mina.
Hi, Mina.
I'm here representing World Bitcoin FIS. And I have 2 questions. So the first is, what makes your key management solution both more secure or user-friendly compared to competitors like Fireblast?
Mm-hmm.
And my second question is, you have a wide list of licensed custodians that are using your Vault technology, or is it mainly trading desks?
Question number 2, I can tell you right now, There are about 9,653 NDAs wrapped around it, so I'm not going to give you an answer on that one, but you're going to hear about it pretty soon. The first question, fireblocks and copper, the everlasting competition. Now, there is a lot of stuff that we do the same way, which is good. Thank God that there is not just one. We lost curve, which is sad to a certain extent. But in terms of like access and what you can do from a UI UX perspective and how you can interact, there is a lot of similarities. When it comes to the custodial bit, we are vastly different. Never mind, add-on products like ClearLoop, which I think they built something. I think you built something, right? But they have to play some catch up there. But what it basically comes down to is the fact that you have the core question coming back to where does your key material sit? And I'm not going to go into details because it wouldn't be fair of like how you can be in a position of having to, have to explain of how assets, for example, can be lost. Now, the way that we are positioned differently, and this is why I'm urging people to ask that question, which is maybe going to, increase change, is the fact of like figuring out that if you have operationally anything happening on the custodial level, are you asset safe? That's the core question. If copper disappears tomorrow, or myself and Dimmer or my business partners lose their shit and we're deleting everything that is available, you still need to be able to have access to your funds. And as long as this question is being answered clearly, you have your answer. Very, very, very simple. Those are the differences. In many other ways, absolutely great technology solution, both solving certain problems extremely well. Fireblocks is amazing on the settlement layer. Amazing. Where we have been focusing more on the custodial layer with interaction to exchanges. That's one of the differences. But that's where you need to kind of ask those questions. And that's why, we're all here. So questions asked, hopefully you get the answers. Yeah.
I'm not a technical person, so forgive me if this is an overly basic question. But can you explain at a conceptual level how MPC is different from a 2 of 3 multi-sig wallet?
In terms of
security,
the multi-sig in its basic form has a private key that has been in existence.
Right.
So the approach base in terms of creating this segregated key material is not re-engineerable, but it is not as secure as the MPC part based on zero-knowledge proof. That's in a nutshell. This is where you would need to go into the cryptography. Like Lindell basically wrote this out quite nicely. I would highly suggest that you read this because that would be a whole hour by itself, and I'm not the right guy talking around cryptography.
But bottom line, cryptographically speaking, MPC is more secure than 2 of 3 multisig.
Yes, in my opinion, clearly.
I think I was not generally, sorry, on cryptography.
No, there you go. He answers the questions on cryptography.
Because the question is, very much like you set up the key material. In multisig, you can set it up in the segregated
Instances as well, yeah.
So that's fine. And it's actually harder if you do MPC. So I do have 2 or 3 questions if you don't mind.
Please don't ask me cryptography questions.
General,
please don't.
Or do you do specific things like question signatures for generating? Eventually, it's about generating signatures.
Mm-hmm.
You want to move massive signature.
Yeah.
So do you do general MPC to do that, or do you have specific protocols for each of the signature schemes you need to support?
There are specific signature methodologies that you need to support for different chains.
Right. So you do have like the CDSA threshold and
yes.
Everything else. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And how do you do the key setup? Because that's what I didn't understand from the slide, and that's crucial. You need to set up the key material already in a distributed way, obviously, right? Because otherwise you have it in the case.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give me a pointer of how you do that? Like what protocol you're based on, or
like in terms of the actual creation during the actual wallet creation,
exactly.
using a.
Generate
my God, can I catch? I thought nobody was supposed to let cryptographers in.
I was told at the beginning.
No. This is just a joke. What I would highly suggest is that we have a chat later, and I'm going to put you in touch with Jake, who's our Chief Information Security Officer, and they can answer you all those questions that you have in much better ways than I could ever do.
So great.
Good questions. Please come.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Where's the fee or the fees charged and how much?
The fees.
Yeah.
Well, Okay, so that depends, right? On the pure custodial side, we're currently charging as a standard rate 2.5 pips per month. We're not doing withdrawals and deposits, so we don't do movements because we take the more custodial approach. And then it depends what kind of service level you go on top. You take Vault Garden, you take DeFi, you take staking, you take whatever it is. ClearLoop, maybe. So also for you, sir, Mike and Marcos are the ones at the back here. They're perfectly placed in order to give you a full rundown of how we charge for them. But it's based on AUC, not on movements. Yes?
How often do you refresh the ClearLoop balance with the exchanges?
In terms of realized P&L or in terms of...
Yeah, if you have a one-day move on the exchange,
yeah.
Are you real-time updating the trading account?
It's your balance that is sitting on the exchange. Your trading is still there. This is very important. You don't trade through us. So you still trade with the venue directly. Whatever you see on screen is what you have. It's just the collateral and ultimately your margin balance that just sits at a third-party custodian. That's the difference. In terms of updating, we are being prompted, for example, it depends from exchange to exchange. On average, what you're doing is as soon as you realize the P&L, the settlement instruction is being issued. Depending on what kind of instrument you trade, you can have 8-hour cycles where you basically just rebalance. But it varies from exchange to exchange.
So in theory, you have an 8-hour credit risk against the exchange for the movement on that.
The movement in terms of you being liquidated, for example, if this is what you're talking about.
The exchange goes bust and owes me money.
Yes.
For that 8-hour time.
Well, the important part is that the exchange holds balances with us, so it should be covered.
Even the mark-to-market.
The mark-to-market should be covered. But it depends. I mean, in case that you have, I mean, we're talking about those extreme corner cases, right? Satoshi comes out as this is just a hoax, everything's not true, and the whole thing is just going down. I mean, there are some quite significant problems that you need to face, and there would be a scramble. I'm not saying that we are in any shape or form, as of right now at least, the CCP in this instance, which we're looking into. But what you basically have is the dispute is still between you and the venue directly. That's the way that it is right now. But we are thinking along those lines.
Do you want to take one more question?
One more?
We have run out of time. According to the club, but
please.
Just back to the custodian. You guys position yourself as more custodians rather than
technology
trading providers. And the trading partners, the exchange and the entity, are dealing directly with one another, but they're trusting you to keep balance and information about the risks involved.
Keep the collateral.
To a certain degree, you're party to the exercise, and I would guess that both parties are buying some of your risk as well, being able to do your job. So your balance sheet is somehow also relevant to the overall discussion. But you're not a startup anymore, but you're still sort of startup size. But for large institutions, you might not be big enough to actually be party to that constellation.
I'm like, in terms of like a balance sheet exercise, I can tell you that our balance sheet is pretty good. It's solid, but I understand where you're coming from. The question is, in terms of like us carrying additional risk because the collateral now sits with us instead of with the exchanges, right? Now, in this case, first and foremost, you talk about segregation. What I haven't mentioned yet is the way that we built this is every single vault that you see, or every single vault that you have, is fully segregated within the infrastructure on the blockchain and on the software level. So, which means that from a counterparty risk perspective, if something horrible happens to Copper, in this instance, let's take this approach, like I said earlier, your assets are untouched, which is extremely crucial. So the segregation part is the key piece. If you have an omnibus infrastructure, like most of the exchanges do, you have a massive problem, because if something goes wrong there, you're on the hook. But this is why I say, limiting and mitigating central points of risk is that's the whole exercise here. That's why we get those questions. I'm happy to share a legal opinion with you as well. I'm going to cook that basically says in terms of operational counterparty risk, in terms of that you take on with Copper because of your assets sitting there instead of the exchanges, you don't have that problem anymore. No worries.
thank you so much, Boris.